If you haven't heard about Anchor, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Please, let me explain. 1, it is free. 2, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from the phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many others. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It is everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So please, download the free Anchor app and go to anchor.fm and get started today.
The Ear, Evangelical and Reformed Christian Podcast. Welcome to The Ear, the Evangelical and Reformed, a Christian podcast that urges you to think deeper and draws you closer to God through faith. Through powerful sermons, teaching segments, and discussions, The Ear hopes to give you a different perspective on secular topics from a Christian worldview. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Please welcome your host, Brandon Queen.
You can't have everybody being the leader of everything. Most organizations, whether it's a business or a church or a ministry, tend to function well when you have a couple of people, one more, that are kind of in charge, which is why the church has elders.
In the real world, it often works the same way too. Consider basketball, for example. Michael Jordan, who is universally recognized as the greatest basketball player ever, had Scottie Pippen at his side. Kobe Bryant had Shaquille O'Neal at his side.
For instance, if I say, oh yeah, man, I'd be singing right along with Paul and Silas, but we don't sing when we get a bad doctor's report, or if we don't sing when we get a bill that we can't handle, or we don't sing when somebody treats us wrong at church, or somebody's mean to us. If we don't sing in these lesser pains, then why would we think that, maybe things are going to be different at the worst moment of our lives?
We have to remember that heaven and earth will pass away, but God's word will remain forever. However, God will call the most unnoticed person to be his sidekick to do his work for his glory alone. Are you willing to be the sidekick to the person God assigned you to? How do we know that God is calling us to be a sidekick? Let us learn how Silas lived into his role as a sidekick that glorified God and pushed the gospel forward.
Good morning, podcast world. Good morning, listeners. Welcome back. First and foremost, I'd like to thank God for giving me a voice to spread his word to all mankind. I want to thank him for using me as a sidekick to humbly follow his command in Matthew 28, verse 19, and that this podcast would bring solid and biblical content to the ears of our listeners. Today, I want to introduce a man that has done some amazing things with the gifts that God has blessed him with. This dude wrote several books, one including a Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards, and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. And he just dropped a brand new book entitled Unknown, The Extraordinary Influence of Ordinary Christians. My next guest is going to be working on another project soon. I'm not sure what it is, but he's got something up his sleeve. I know him. Mm-hmm. So please welcome to the show my good friend, Matthew Everhard. How's it going, Matt?
What's up, Brandon? Thank you so much for having me back, man. This is my third or fourth episode recording with you on The Ear. I know, actually, maybe it's my fifth. I've been around a while.
Yeah, it is your fifth. You've been around a while.
Was I your first ever guest?
Actually,
We'll have to go back. We'll have to go back and review the archives and the annals of history.
Actually, if you want to talk like legit guests, because I use my roommates as guests for my first episode, but if you want to talk about legit guests, I think you were the first.
Okay. Hopefully your listener or your roommates aren't listening to this episode, because they're legit too. Roommates, if you're out there, you're just as legit.
They don't listen to the podcast. They don't.
Okay, good.
And it's just going to happen. They're going to listen to this one, and I'm going to hear an earful.
Yeah, exactly. Or somebody they know is going to listen to it and be like, hey, man, weren't you on that dude's show?
That dude said this.
Exactly.
All right. So today is episode 3 of our teaching series called Unknown, the Extraordinary Influence of Ordinary Christians, written by Matthew Everhard. So this is the 3rd episode, and this one is called Silas, the Sidekick. And Silas is one of those, smaller, lesser-known Bible characters that we often don't preach about, talk about, forget about, but he's one of those people that happen to be a sidekick. So last week we talked about Ananias the mentor, and we're going to move forward this week and talk about Silas the sidekick. So without further ado, my first question of the evening is, what is this thing about sidekicks in the Bible, Matt? Why did you call Silas the sidekick?
That's a great question. Well, again, we're looking at the minor characters in the book of Acts, people who helped Paul along the way, although Paul is indisputably the main character, second only to Christ, of course. Christ is the main character in the whole Bible, cover to cover. I want to be clear about that. But in the book of Acts, we're following the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul, starting in chapter 9, which we talked about last week. And the theme is these lesser-known characters, thus the name of the book, Unknown. And the big idea is that we don't have to be a famous person to be of extraordinary influence in the kingdom. So in this chapter, I'm looking at Paul's sidekick, particularly Silas, who we probably know a little bit less about than even Barnabas, which was Paul's first sidekick. We'll get into that in a few minutes, I hope. But we do see this little trend happening throughout Scripture that certain of the great men of the faith also had buddies, sidekicks, friends, partners in ministry, however we want to describe it. And so we can all go all the way back to, for instance, Elijah and Elisha. Sometimes we confuse them because their names are so similar, but Elijah had a sidekick named Elisha who came along after him and did some wonderful works of power as well as Elijah did. And then we have David and Jonathan. David's best friend was Jonathan, the son of King Saul. So we might consider Jonathan a sidekick of David. And then even Christ, he had his 12 disciples. They could all be considered sidekicks. But amongst the 12, there were the 3, Peter, James, and John. And amongst the 3, there was the one, which was Peter, who seems to be in more scenes than some of the other disciples. And so Paul is like these other great men of the faith in having, we might call a junior partner along to help him. And Paul had both Barnabas in the first case, and then in our chapter, we're looking at Silas, his second sidekick.
Okay, perfect. I kind of like the name Silas, and if I had twin boys, they would be called Elijah and Elisha. Just to throw that out there. And trust me.
Yeah, I like that.
I only want one child. If I ever have a child, and if it's a boy, I'm going to name him after me. But if God blesses me with twins, I'm definitely going to name them Elijah and Elisha. I love those 2 names.
Uh-huh.
All right.
Got it.
So, all right, Matt, what would be your sidekick name?
If I was a sidekick? Well, I think I am a sidekick. I'm your sidekick. I came up with your name. Your name is Brandon Queen, the podcast king. That's what I'm going to call you from now on. I think that that rolls off the tongue.
Brandon Queen, the podcast king.
Isn't that hilarious? I love that. You got to make that your new moniker from now on. That's hilarious.
Brandon.
I guess my sidekick name would be like the Bearded One or something like. It'd be like Brandon Queen, the podcast king, and his sidekick, the Bearded One. I think that's what I'd go by.
Where his beard holds all the knowledge.
Yeah. Or maybe I'm the sidekick of my beard instead of the other way around. I don't know. Either way, good question.
That would be funny. That would be funny. All right. So now that we got that out the way, let's actually get some real stuff done here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all right, Matt, for this chapter, we talk about Silas, you use him as your reference, and we taking a look at Acts chapter 16 and 15. Why did the Apostle Paul and the other apostles need sidekicks?
Well, I guess in one sense we don't, because each one of us can follow Christ and be saved and be a Christian. However, we definitely need each other in this journey of life. And I am not a big fan of these solo Christian concepts that you could be a healthy Christian out there just doing it by yourself, which is one reason. Let me just make a side road here to say, hey, if you're not going to church, you need to be in church, man, because you're not strong enough to do this by yourself. So we do need others. We need friendship. We need fellowship. We need encouragement. We need comforters. And even if we're the kind of alpha male type personality that tends to like to be out there kind of in the lead, you're not sufficient in and of yourself. You don't have all the gifts. You don't have all the graces. You don't have all the fruits. You need others. And so I think even a guy like Paul, who's just extraordinarily blessed, he needs friendships, needs support, needs somebody by his side. And so this is why we don't see people going out usually one by one in the New Testament. We see them going out two by two or in greater numbers because we need each other.
And I think it was designed that way. I think God designed it to where we would rely on him, but be each other's sidekick, if you will, or support system.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
It's funny you say that, we need each other and we should go to church and stuff. That brings me back to season 2, episode 1 with Cameron Schaefer and his dialogue on why we need to go to church and why the church is important. And I think reading this passage in Acts, and it talks about Silas, being there with Paul, brings all of that to light. Paul would have been a miserable soul, and I think all the apostles would have been miserable people had they did this all on their own. Like once Christ left and they had to go to each, surrounding area by themselves, I think they would have been miserable. I think they would have gave up a long time ago.
Yeah, true.
Now, to get a little deep here, so how do you know that God is calling us to be sidekicks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if we think about this logically, it makes sense that some of us should be sidekicks because you can't have everybody being the leader of everything. Most organizations, whether it's a business or a church or a ministry, tend to function well when you have a couple of people, one more, that are kind of in charge, which is why the church has elders. Each did our own thing, and every single person wanted to be the boss. We would run into conflict all the time if we don't already. And so it does seem to make sense that this suits our personalities and our giftedness, that not everybody should have a microphone in front of their face leading some kind of a vision quest. But there are other people that come along and support, and they have supporting gifts. So one of the things I'd say is if, God may be calling you to be a sidekick if you have sidekick-type gifts. We all have gifts to serve the Lord, but not everybody's a dynamic, vision-casting, vocal, visible leader. Some people tend to like to be in the shadows and do their better work when they're off on the sidelines, helping others out, often in very invisible but yet significant ways.
Yeah, that's me. I like to be in the shadows, and lately I've been pushed to the spotlight on some things, which is kind of uncomfortable for me. Honestly, to be honest with you, being a podcast host is really uncomfortable, but I have a job to do, and I have a message that needs to get out to those who don't know Christ. So I will chalk it up and do it when it comes to that. But this question brings me to one of my church members. Her name is Monica Lundgren, and a beautiful, beautiful spirited woman. She runs the Operation Christmas Child event at our church every single year. And one of the things that I did, I get a chance to help with the liturgy in my church whenever I'm off from work. And it just so happened I was off, and I had just talked to you about the book and about getting the series going and everything. And I got in the pulpit and I said, the Bible has a lot of unknown or lesser known characters, most like our congregation. And I want to point out, this year,